Hi, I'm Martin Hallett, and some of you may be watching this video because you already know me, and some of you maybe have just found it on YouTube, the way YouTube tends to thrust us into videos that we've never seen before. So, anyway, whatever reason that you're looking at this, thank you for being with me. I want to share something of my story, and I did this in a previous video, to be honest, and there was some misunderstanding about some of the things that I was saying, and so I wanted to try and make it clearer in this new video. So if you've seen a lot of or heard a lot of what I'm sharing already, then I apologize for that. But I felt it was right to maybe try and do a completely new video and this time make it a little less clear, a little more clear, I should say, really where I was going. So this is my story as a Christian, and what I've been involved in my relationship with the Lord over many years now. Well, as a child, I was quite happy, stable home environment, had a lot of good friends at school and so on. I had an older brother. He was 13 years older, so he was always, in a sense, a bit like an adult to me. Well, he was an adult to me as far as I was concerned, and something of a role model too. He was an actor, and to be honest, most of his life was something of a drama in all sorts of different ways. And so he was, he was the kind of person that you couldn't help stop reacting to because he was larger than life in lots of ways. And I remember at one particular time when I was about 7 or 8 years old, he was actually at Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford-on-Avon, and he was actually only walking on. He wasn't doing any big parts or anything like that. But he became very friendly with people like Richard Burton and Lawrence Harvey and Vivian Leigh, and I think he danced with and so on. So he got to know these famous people in lots of ways, and through him I met them. And I remember particularly meeting Lawrence Harvey and Richard Burton. And like I say, I was only about 7 or 8 at the time. And they gave me this large sort of A4 size photograph of themselves, and they signed it to Dear Martin, bless you, lots of love, Larry, or lots of love, Richard. And I used to take these pictures with me everywhere I went. And I remember my father saying to me one day, I'm going to tell them that you're in love with them because you seem to take it everywhere. Now, I remember that, so it must have been significant. It must have struck a few notes in me, but I certainly, at that time, wouldn't have seen myself. Obviously, I was too young, I guess. I wouldn't have seen myself as being gay or anything like that. But I did get crushes on guys at school and some of the teachers and so on. And so there was obviously something there. But then as I got a bit older, I became more sexually aware and more sexually active. And after a period of time, and I'm talking about, probably a few years, I eventually developed friendships with a lot of really good gay friends who were very supportive of each other. We used to go on holiday together, to the theatre together, so on and so forth, very supportive of each other. And in a sense, I wasn't really leading a double life because socially, all my friends were gay. So I didn't have that kind of conflict that many people do of, doing one thing on one day and another thing with somebody else on another day, feeling split. I wasn't very open. Well, I wasn't open at all with people that I worked with and so on about my sexuality. I think they may have assumed things, to be honest, but I was never very open about it at all. Nor with my parents, although again, my brother was gay, and so they were very much well aware of that. But he had some kind of fetishes which I think troubled them quite a bit. And so, in a way, without speaking to them about it, I wanted to try and show them that my gay friends were very different and that they were much more normal in many ways. And so I was trying to give that impression to my parents so that they wouldn't be worried and concerned about me. But we never directly talked about it. So it was an unspoken kind of knowledge that they knew that I was gay too. And so this went on. And although I was quite promiscuous, I think deep down I was searching for the perfect relationship, the perfect partner. I'm sure that's true for many gay people. Then eventually one day I was introduced to this guy called Ian, who a friend of mine had met. And he was a very attractive guy, I thought. And I started to get to know him a bit. And he said to me, Martin, I'm a Christian, and I'm not sure whether it's right for me as a Christian to be involved in gay relationships. Now I thought, well, you're new, you're naive, you'll soon change your mind when you've been around a bit. So he met all my friends, of course, and took him to a few gay parties and so on. Well, at least I didn't take him. I was holding the parties myself, so I invited him to come along, and he seemed to enjoy it very much. But then one day I was actually driving home from Chester, because I lived in Liverpool at the time. I was driving home from Chester, and I remember talking to God, and in a sense, I used to talk to God. I used to say my prayers at night. Maybe used to keep my fingers crossed and not walk under ladders, just to keep all the options open. So there was a kind of a belief system there, and I'd been to crusaders and stuff like that, but I never at all questioned whether God would be unhappy with my lifestyle. And although in a sense I'd heard about the gospel when I was at school, we were talking about Jesus dying for our sins, but it didn't really register what it was actually meaning. They were just words. It didn't really mean very much to me. But then on my way home from Chester, I remember crying out to God and saying, oh, this relationship with Ian, I like him very much. He's really nice. I don't know how it's going to work out. Is it going to be yet another relationship that's not going to work out? And I thought God, maybe it was God, maybe it wasn't God, but I thought in some way God may have said to me, Martin, I brought him in your life for you. And so I started to think, well, if God really has brought this really nice person into my life for me, maybe I ought to take God a bit more seriously and learn more of what it means to be a Christian. And so ultimately, I made a commitment to Christ and started to follow him. And my friend Ian actually moved away from Liverpool and went back to London. So he wasn't such a high priority in my kind of, certainly in my social life or in my thought life even. You know, I was still very fond of him, I know, but in a sense he'd moved on. But I had made a commitment to Christ, and I went to see the vicar that Ian had been to see, who he'd found very helpful in talking about his sexuality. And this was a guy called Count Roy Barker. Ultimately he became Canon Roy Barker. And Roy said to me, Martin, there are many people who would say to you as Christians, there's nothing wrong with being involved in gay relationships. But I personally, with respect, don't agree with that. And so I thought, well, maybe he's right. And as I started to think about it, I thought, well, actually, I suppose in a sense, although, you know, I'd been quite involved sexually with a lot of people, it had been a search for love. So maybe in some way, God can provide this love for me in maybe a non-sexual way, or at least in a non-sex way, I suppose, in that sense. Maybe that's a positive way forward. And so I can develop really good relationships which don't involve sex. Maybe that could be a way forward for me. And so in my early days as a Christian, I wondered if that could be the right way forward for me. And I started to grow and develop as a Christian. The other thing that happened was that Roy Barker was very much of the ethos that when you become a Christian, God uses you because of who you are and because of your own background. For example, a couple of years before I arrived on the scene, he'd had Cliff Richard for a weekend. So he thought, a Christian pop singer, I'll arrange some meetings with some local Merseyside pop groups so that they can learn what it means to be a pop singer and a Christian. So when he had a homosexual in the church, he thought, great, we've got a homosexual in the church. How can we use him? He made me feel special. He made me feel valuable. had made me recognize that I had a ministry. Now, I wouldn't have thought or talked about it in those terms then. It wasn't until many years later I realized what was happening at that time. But I believe it was a very, very positive and good start for me as a Christian, that I wasn't made to believe that I was the person with a problem any more than anyone else had problems, because of course we all have problems. But in a sense, I was made to feel special and valuable as a Christian, and that God could use me because of who I am rather than despite it. So those were messages that I was getting very, very early on in my Christian life, which I've always felt have been extremely, extremely valuable. And so I continued to grow and develop as a Christian. Had very little contact with Ian, although saw him from time to time. We kept in touch, obviously, and I let him know what was happening in my life. And I also developed a really close relationship with the curate of the church, John Walker, who, in a sense, many people looked up to him. He was quite a charismatic sort of character person, looked a little bit like a stereotypical Jesus with long hair and a beard and so on. And I know many of the girls had a soft spot for him, maybe even stronger than that. So he was a very sort of popular person. But what meant a lot to me, that he was prepared to be seen as my friend openly in front of other people. I mean, sometimes he'd look across to me at a meeting and said, "Are you okay, Mark? Are you okay?" And my immediate reaction was, "Don't do that. People get the wrong idea. They think there's something going on." But what really thrilled me and what really touched me was the fact that he was prepared to be seen and known as a friend, as a close friend of mine. And so that again was a very, very positive experience as a Christian. So my Christian growth continued for a few years. And then I started to think about really how I could be of more use in the church. And I had a vision for a ministry that would be like a twofold ministry, partly offering counselling and pastoral support for people, for Christians who were struggling with homosexual or lesbian issues, but also a ministry to the church, so that in a sense, as I was growing and learning, so I could share what I was learning with the church, with other Christians, and also know of churches to whom I could then refer people who were contacting me. So I presented this vision, this idea, to a few very prominent evangelical Christians in London. We had several meetings about it, but nothing actually materialized. And then Roy Barker, the vicar, said to me, "Martin, well, I don't see why we can't start something up here. Let's see, what do we need? We need a trust, we need a council reference, we need all these." And he started to give me a whole list of things to do, articles to write, and people to contact, although he obviously contacted a lot of people too. And we started a ministry, and that was in 1977. And it was very much fulfilling the vision that I had for such a ministry. Now, one of the reasons that that ministry started, and I had the vision for the ministry, was that several years earlier, I was getting quite some strong experience as a Christian. Very often that happens, doesn't it? That when we're a new Christian, God wants to encourage us in different ways, so he gives us different experiences. That doesn't always happen, of course, but it happened for me. Probably it was necessary for me to very much cement my relationship with the Lord. And one of the experiences I had was after church. One particular Sunday, I remember looking at the notice board and it said 8th after Trinity. And I had to drive about a 40-minute drive, because at that time I was living quite a few miles away from the church. And on my drive home, I started adding up all sorts of different figures in my head, and they were all coming to 8. And I thought, why am I doing this? This is crazy, most peculiar. And I kept on doing that, and it all was coming to 8 all the time. And I thought, what's going on here? And then eventually, when I got home, I started to, as I often did, contact Ian in London and just share with him something of what was going on. And when I looked at his address, because of course I know I have to write, when I looked at his address, it was 80 Touchbrook Street in London. And I thought, oh, 8 again, isn't that weird? And then I opened the Bible that he'd given me, looked on the front cover. I don't know why I'd not noticed it before, but it said, John chapter 8. Jesus said, if you continue in my word, then you're truly my disciples and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John chapter 8. So I thought, oh gosh, 8 again. And I thought, this is silly. This is really getting silly. Then the following morning, and I had to wake up very early in those days because I was working in the family bakery business, and I noticed there was a butterfly trapped in the kitchen, my small kitchen. And my first kind of response was to try and help it to get out. It was the red admiral butterflies that happened. So I kind of opened the window and it flew away. And almost immediately, the words came into my mind, which I think were from the Lord, you set it free. And you will be helping to set people free, which I thought was pretty extraordinary. But again, that kind of thing was happening fairly frequently at that time in my life. Maybe not so frequently since then. Following Wednesday, I went to the church meeting and sat down. Guy who was leading the meeting stood up and said, now, today we're going to be looking at John chapter 8. And this time it nearly blew me away, I must admit. I remember looking around, people with their open Bibles, and it almost looked like they were shining. It was really extraordinary. And I actually stood up and shared, how much this John chapter 8 verses had meant to me. I didn't go to all the details that I've just shared with you, but I shared something of that. And to be honest, that was very rare for me to actually have the courage to stand up and say that. But I felt so moved, in a sense, I guess, by the Spirit that I did that and shared that. And so, in a sense, that was really what brought into my mind that maybe one day there should be a ministry that I should be involved in. So going back to our time with Roy, when Roy started to give me some things to do to start this ministry, and we started it. I was working at the church hall at the time as a kind of caretaker, and I had to, I had a few, we used to advertise in the Christian press, and I had some responses, and then I would send literature to them, and so it went on. And eventually, somebody asked if they could come and see me. And this evolved into several people, of course, doing that. And then I noticed something that I think is very significant, because I noticed that the people who were coming to see me, the majority were Christians, but they were really struggling with homosexuality or same-sex attraction. They were finding it very difficult to believe that they were valued and loved, but they were very rarely, if maybe often never at all, sharing it with anyone else. I've lost count of the number of times somebody has said to me, Martin, you're the first person that I've shared this with. And that puts people like me in a very privileged position, doesn't it? Because if somebody shares something with you that they've never shared with anyone else, then it's a bit like being on holy ground, because the only other person who knows about this is God himself. So in a sense, the majority of people who contact me were coming from a very different background to my own. And that was something I learned very early on in this work. Some were married, some were single, some were actively involved in church work, some were church leaders, coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, but having that in common, the secrecy and fear, and finding it very difficult to believe that God could use them. People would often say to me, Martin, I think God will really use me one day when I've got this thing sorted. And I wouldn't have said this, but I was very tempted to say, well, you might have to wait a long time, for that. I think God can, what I would have said was that God can use you now. And I would often encourage them to know that I had been blessed, that God had used them to bless me by simply sharing their situation with me in that way. I mean, I hope that didn't sound too trite, but it was true. And so that was the common experience of the majority of people who were contacting the ministry. And so we developed, and I was going round of ultimately, we're talking over here about a progression of many years. I was ultimately going round theological colleges, Christian unions, churches to talk about the issue and so on, involved in some dialogues, sometimes involving confrontation with people with a very different viewpoint, which I always found very difficult, to be honest. But I felt much more comfortable talking to a Christian group who were, in a sense, in agreement with what I was saying, because I guess I'm a coward at the end of the day. So this is how the work developed. And ultimately, I mean, at first, of course, I was the only person involved. I was doing the printing. I was doing most of the printing anyway. Some of it, was done by somebody at our church. But I was certainly distributing the newsletter, writing the newsletter, seeing people, doing the talking. Basically, the ministry was just me. And I longed to have other people involved. Initially, I encouraged some people who'd already contacted me for support and help to get more involved, and they did. And we had what we call a working party. But again, after many years, ultimately, the trustees decided that we should have an administrator to help us with the ministry. And that was very, very helpful, because it took a lot of the pressures off me. And I really felt supported and helped and encouraged by the administrators that we had, both in the early days and latter day. Somebody called Martin, who was very much involved in supporting the ministry and helping it to grow and develop and so on. So that was a big help. And one of the other things that happened as we were growing and developing was that along with another person who'd be helping the ministry called Dan, we developed something called a Ways Forward course, which I still think is actually very helpful, because it wasn't just dealing with sexuality itself, it was dealing with the underlying driving forces that are often behind our sexuality: the need for love, the need to be loved, the need to know that we're valued, self-worth and self-acceptance, as well as, of course, addiction issues and so on. It was dealing with those kind of issues. And so many people would say to me that what we were looking at was relevant to people, whatever their sexuality may be, because it was basically talking about some growth issues that we all need to have as Christians. And we towards the end of the course, we encourage people to recognize that every person has a ministry, no matter how able or disabled they feel. Everyone, every Christian, has a unique ministry because of their uniqueness and their unique value. And that was very much something that we were focusing on later on in the Ways Forward course, which I think personally was very valuable. So this, after many years, after more than 30 years, well over 30 years, the time had come for me to retire, and needed to find someone who would continue the work of the ministry, stepping into my shoes. And to be honest, there weren't very many people around who I think would be comfortable and happy to do that. But there was one person who was a really good Bible teacher, and he also had been open about his own sexuality, his own same-sex attractions. And so he seemed to be the ideal person. But one of the things that I should have realized, but didn't, was, well, I didn't at the time, was that he'd not actually been involved in a lot of the things that had been involved in the growth of the ministry. He'd come in kind of later on, So he obviously had his own ideas, which is fair enough. Um, Eventually, he took over the ministry, and I was, in a sense, thrilled about that. It was nice to be able to let go in a way and retire. But one of the things that I noticed was that, in a sense, his way of approaching things was very different from mine. Well, I guess that's normal in a sense. But a lot of the ways in which I'd been, especially through the Ways Forward course and so on, didn't seem to be so much used in the ministry. It was very much to do with biblical teaching and good biblical teaching. And obviously, I'm not saying that was wrong. It was very good, but there were different focuses in the ministry. And I guess part of me wished that maybe I ought to have been a little bit more thorough in recognizing that my original kind of thinking would be continued in a way. I guess I'd assumed that most of the other people who'd been involved in the ministry with me were very much thinking along the same lines, but I'm not really sure now that they were, to be honest. Again, that's not their fault, of course. I'm not blaming anyone here. It's nobody's fault. It's just the way it was. And, well, in a sense, it's nobody's fault. In a sense, it's probably my fault because I ought to have taken more care to assure that the ministry would be going more in the same direction as I'd felt God was leading me with the ministry. And so I retired, and that was well over 10 years ago now. And it was nice to be free, of the ministry in lots of ways. But of course, I'd made it very clear that I would still be available for anyone who wanted any advice, because I think I'd learned quite a lot. Well, I'm sure I'd learned quite a lot over those 35 years of working in the ministry. I'm sad to say that never happened. I was never asked for advice. I mean, occasionally I was asked about somebody who might have been on the database, or maybe some technical detail in an article that I'd written, and so on. But I was never asked about for any help about issues that I'd been working with, or people that I'd been working with, and what I'd learned. I mean, for example, I remember seeing in one of the newsletters that the ministry being contacted by quite a few people with transgender issues, and it would be nice to know a little bit more about that. And I thought, well, I wrote a couple of articles about transgender issues. I met a lot of people and learned quite a lot, I think, about those kind of issues, but nobody asked me. So again, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that to criticize, but I guess it made me feel, well, what's been going on, all these years since I retired, what's been going on? And then several years after I'd retired, I started to rethink some of the biblical. I mean, obviously, we'd worked through scripture an awful lot in the ministry, because that's a major part of the ministry. But I suppose I felt a bit more freedom to explore those biblical areas a little bit more, and found myself at least coming to some kind of an agreement with many of the people that at one time I would have disagreed with, in a sense, and having a rethink about it. And this was after many years of retirement, probably, certainly several years after I'd retired. I started to rethink, and ultimately came to the conclusion that I'm not actually sure that I can say to everyone that all same-sex sexual relationships are wrong as far as God is concerned. And that was partly because of re-examining the scriptural evidence. It was partly because of the many people had seen in this ministry that had subsequently got involved in a committed relationship and seemed to be much more whole and complete and actually nicer people as a result of that. Now, I know some people could say, well, that's all experiential and so on. I would have certainly argued against that at one time. But again, it was part of the evidence that made me think again about what I believed. Now, in this second video, I'm going to be looking at the scriptural stuff a little bit more thoroughly, not in a huge amount of depth, but to explain a little bit more about how I was feeling. But that's in the second video. So ultimately, after all those years, in a sense, I started to rethink, and I obviously had to tell the people that I'd been working with how I was feeling, or at least some of the people involved. That was only fair that I, changed some of my conclusions. Now I have to say that the only thing that had actually changed was my conclusion about it always being wrong. Everything else I think I'd learned and grown and developed. I still very much believe, and I don't regret all those years of celibacy in my own life at all. I don't regret it at all. I see it all as a part of the kind of growth process, but I'm very conscious that some people will find it difficult to hear what I'm saying. Some people might feel hurt, and obviously I don't want that. And really that's the main reason why I haven't been so public about my current feelings as I am now, because I didn't want. I was afraid of hurting people in a sense. Maybe I ought to have been more courageous. So I only shared how I was feeling with a few close friends, and of course the vicar, the current vicar at the church where I worship, and so on. So I didn't want to be deceitful about that. But then, moving on from there, again talking about a year or two after, I'd changed my viewpoint in that sense. While I was praying, I very much felt the Lord saying to me that I shouldn't waste all those things that I'd learned all those years, the people that I'd met, and things that I really thought it would be good to explore more, particularly how our sexuality develops, and sexual attraction, how that develops. I mean, one of the amazing things is, and I often used to say this, that if you're the elephant man with one tooth, one leg, and whatever, there would be some people who would be sexually attracted to you, because it's so variable, whether you're old, young, fat, thin, tall, whatever. The sexual attraction is so complex and variable, sometimes changeable as well, as in different times, in different ways. I was never into the conversion therapy type stuff where people wanted to be changed from homosexual to heterosexual. I was always very, very wary of that, although I had met some people who changed from, and experienced heterosexual feelings for the first time, but I'd also met many people who'd suddenly experienced homosexual feelings for the first time and then only been aware of heterosexual feelings. So I didn't question the fact that our sexuality isn't always very static, although I guess for most people it is. But having said all that, so I wasn't into some of the therapeutic processes that wanted to encourage people to see only change into heterosexual feelings will make you normal. I mean, they may not have put it in those terms, but that seemed to be what they were saying. I'd never felt comfortable about that at all. And I suppose that's also partly because I'd always been encouraged to see my own sexuality as an important part of my value and who I was. So I desperately wanted other people to see that as well. And I think that's the thing that I most struggled with, to be honest. It was very difficult to encourage people to see their sexuality in that way. And so the Lord seemed to be encouraging me to maybe share a little bit of what I've learned. So I did a couple of videos. The idea was really, in my mind, was to have a kind of seminar where we didn't look at the moral issues, but actually looked at how our sexuality can often change, and how our sexuality can often develop in terms of fetishes and so on, trying to understand more about the variations in sexuality and sexual feelings to get more understanding, because I believe that's what God wants us to experience, because he's the only one who fully understands everything and fully has all the answers, if you like. We don't certainly have the answers, but I think we should be walking more down that road as Christians in seeking to understand more about the complexity of sexuality. And so that's what these seminars were intended to be, but they never happened because of COVID. But I did produce a couple of videos, which you probably know about if you've found this video, which weren't looking at the moral issues, but looking more at sexuality itself. And so that brings me up to the present day. And again, talking about a few years after that experience, yet the present day we have something in the Church of England called Living in Love and Faith. And at first I thought, well, this is just going to be the same as the kind of discussions we used to have years ago. It's been going on for years, this. But I think it's different. And I think it's different because in a sense it's encouraging us to listen to each other, whatever we feel or believe, encouraging us to listen and to understand each other. My only concern is, to be honest, I think it maybe even has become a little bit political, because different people will be, in a sense, defending their own particular viewpoints and wanting to put that across. Sometimes people even talking about how they may leave the church, or the Church of England anyway, if it takes a more liberal approach in some way. That concerns me, because I don't think that is really what the ethos of Living in Love and Faith is intended to be about. I think it's much more intended to be about seeking to understand each other. So that's where I'm personally at now, and that's why I'm being now more open about my own feelings and experience. I hope I haven't hurt you or offended you in any way, and I certainly haven't wanted to give any impression of being critical because I wasn't contacted for advice. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying what I believe now for that reason, because my feelings about that were years ago. And, to be honest, I don't think I ever blamed or criticized anyone even then. I just saw it as inevitable because people were not maybe feeling and believing the same kind of things that I was. So in a sense, it just saddens me because, I'd hoped that would happen. So please don't misunderstand the reason for all this. And I'm equally not saying I've shared my position because I now have a boyfriend or a partner. I don't. I'm single. And I think we have to, and I'll be saying more about this, of course, in the other video about the biblical evidence. But I'm not saying that there should be a free for all. I think there should obviously be moral boundaries and so on in the whole area of sexuality. But I think that's much more complex and difficult than we've often been conditioned to believe it to be. And I'd like to see more work in that area, but that's another issue, I guess. So I think the time has come for me to close this video, and I hope, if you haven't seen it already, that maybe you will want to look at the second video, which is talking much more about the biblical processes. So thank you for being there. Thank you for listening to me while I've been going on about my own experiences. And as I said before, I hope if we're friends that we can still be friends. And I hope in a sense we can at least try and embrace the ethos behind living in love and faith, and listen and seek to understand each other. And I just pray that the Lord will enable us to do that. Because of course we always have to ask, what would Jesus say? And how would Jesus respond? I hope that I'm continuing to learn that, more about that, and I'm sure you are too. So thank you for listening.